Hello everyone. In this demo, you learn how to solder the links of your chain. Previously, we soldered the jump rings from the coil of wire. Now we are going to divide the jump rings into two piles. We will open all the jump rings in one pile and close all the others in the other pile. Ideally, I like to use two pairs of flat pliers, but if you only have one pair of flat pliers, then use flat and chain nose. That will work too. But whatever you do, be very careful to position the jaws of the pliers carefully so they don't make an indentation into the metal. Brace yourself on the bench pin. Your pliers move back and forth, not sideways, which would distort the jump rings. It must be a very tight seam, no gap. Solder doesn't fill gaps, no light comes through the seam. So back and forth motion. It should be a closed, a very tight seam, and also the two sides should be perfectly lined up. We won't be able to file the links that are dented because that would change both the shape of the jump rings. This is round wire and it has to stay round, and the size of the wire. The required size is 1.4 millimeters and it has to remain the same. So for that reason, the links must be pristine. Oops, I slipped here. This is a damaged link, so there's a big dent there. So I will put it away. It goes into my recycling pile. So as I was saying, we must keep our links as clean and as pristine as possible. Again, no filing later. So we'll continue closing half the links until we've closed everything in that pile. And now we are going to open the links from the other half, the other pile. So same motion, back and forth with the pliers, and we'll repeat the process until we've opened all the links in the other pile. Now let's have a closer look. This one is good. It has a very tight seam, no gaps, and it's lined up. The two sides are lined up. That's good. That's what we're looking for. The other one here in our example is not very good. You can see there is a gap and the two sides are not lined up. So this is not usable. It would have to be tightened so you can solder. Let me show you how to cut your solder. For this project, we'll use only hard solder. AG, the symbol AG stands for silver, fine silver or pure silver, and 675 to the amount of silver in the solder. For more details on types of solder and composition, please check your handouts. So this is how you cut your solder safely. Close your hand a little bit to prevent the pillions or the pieces of solder from jumping everywhere. We'll cut small strips in one direction. And then we'll cut again in the opposite direction. The size of the pieces or pillions of solder depends on the job you need to do. For this job, we need a small size, like you see here, quite small. And now that it's done, we'll transfer the cut solder into a dish. Your solder should not be sitting on your bench when you work. It should be in a dish or some kind of container to keep it very clean. You should have a container to keep your cut solder. Label it so it doesn't get mixed up. For this demo, I'm going to use again a small butane torch. We need flux. I use a borax cone that I grind and mix with distilled water. You also need fire tweezers to handle metal and solder tweezers, which have a very fine tip to pick up the solder. We are going to lay all our jump rings on the brick, on the charcoal block. And but never pick up metal on your brick with your bare hand. You should always use fire tweezers for safety. So we place the jump rings on the brick or the charcoal block here. I put them all in the same position with the seam on top so that I can be more efficient when I solder. And with practice, you'll be able to solder several links one after another. First step, we apply flux on the seam with a small brush. And next, I will dry the flux just a little bit with the torch. It will be easier to keep the solder in place on the seam. Next, take a piece of solder, dip a little bit in flux, and place right on top of the seam. Now we heat up the link, and we heat up the base and the sides evenly, consistently. Basically, we heat up everything except the seam. We have to heat up the entire piece except the seam. Check the flux. When it turns darker, you know it's time to apply heat on the seam itself to melt the solder. So there it is. Always check that the solder has gone right into the seam and all the way through and on the other side as well. For the next one, I speed up the video. You know the steps. Apply flux, dry the flux a little bit with the torch, take a piece of solder that you dip in flux, place it right on top of the seam, and then heat up, and you need to heat up the entire piece first evenly. That's important. Both sides should be heated up exactly in the same way if you want the solder to flow right into the seam all the way through. Keep an eye on the flux. When it turns darker, it's time to apply heat on the seam to melt the solder. Check the other side always. And so this is how you would solder all the closed links first. And we're going to speed up again for that one. Same process. And when the solder flows, after the whole link has been heated up evenly, you see a bright puddle of solder, and then you see it go all the way through. And again, always check the other side to make sure you see the solder on the other side. And that's it. Now on to the next step. Again, to be more efficient, we'll put together several units of 3 links. So we take 2 solid links and we insert them into an open one. And with 2 pairs of pliers, we are going to close that link tightly. Same process as before. Make sure it's lined up. And that's it. And then after these units of 3 are soldered, we will assemble them, solder them together. Now let's solder these units of 3 links. To hold this unit, use the third hand, but make sure you pinch only with the tip of the tweezers as little metal as possible, and do that as far away as possible from the seam. Fire tweezers are heat sinks. They absorb a lot of heat, and that's why we need to do it this way to minimize this effect and to allow the seam to get enough heat and to allow then the solder to flow properly. So just a little bit of metal on the side, not too close to the seam. And make sure the seam is at the top so you have easy access to it with the torch. Repeat the same process as before. Flux the seam. Dry it a little bit with the torch. And place a piece of solder with the solder tweezers right on top of the seam. When you heat up that link, Make sure you work mostly on the sides, avoid the seam at the beginning, and make sure you don't apply too much heat on the 2 previously soldered links. And that's it. And make sure these 2 links are not stuck together. Always check that the solder has gone all the way through and that it shows up on the other side of the seam. Let's look at the process again from a different angle. So again, place the seam at the top for easy access, and make sure the tweezers, which are a heat sink, are not going to prevent the solder from getting enough heat and flowing properly. So again, you have to heat up the link, not from the bottom because the other links are there, we have to be careful, but from going from side to side, and both sides have to be warmed up evenly, otherwise the solder might flow on one side, not really into the seam. So that's it, we have another unit of 3 links soldered. Thanks for watching.